The categorical index was a Selvari academic consortium vessel whose design philosophy reflected the civilization that built it. Precise, elegant, optimized for the specific purpose of enabling scholarly observation without interfering in the phenomena being observed. The ship was classified as a research platform, equipped with advanced sensor arrays, comprehensive data processing systems, and the particular suite of analytical tools that xenoanthropological fieldwork required. It was not equipped for combat. It was not equipped for sustained independent operation in hostile territory. It was equipped, specifically and exclusively, for the purpose of studying things, and the studying was what it did with the quiet, methodical efficiency of a vessel built by a species that considered scholarship the highest form of civilizational contribution. Dr. Lurie Velthessen occupied the research vessel's primary analysis station with the settled, focused posture of a person who had been occupying it for the better part of 12 months, and whose body had adapted to the station's dimensions the way bodies adapted to any workspace that was inhabited long enough. The seat molded to her preferences, the display arranged at the precise distance, an angle that her visual acuity preferred, the surrounding workspace organized with the meticulous order that reflected both her professional methodology and her personal disposition. She was Selvari, the species designation carried in the galactic community's general understanding, a set of associations. Intellectual, analytical, physically refined, culturally committed to scholarship and diplomatic engagement, and constitutionally averse to violence, not through moral choice but through evolutionary heritage. The Selvari having evolved as a prey species on a temperate world with stable ecosystems, and having developed the cognitive specialization and social cooperation that prey species developed when survival depended on outsmarting rather than outfighting. The associations were broadly accurate. Lurie was intellectual and analytical by training and by nature. She was physically refined, 5'7", slender, carrying the elongated proportions that Selvari biology produced, the body optimized for efficiency rather than power. Her skin was pale blue-silver, carrying the soft luminescence that Selvari pigmentation generated, and that shifted in subtle patterns that communicated emotional state with less intensity than the Calithi bioluminescent system, but with similar involuntary honesty. Her features were delicate, fine-boned, angular, the facial architecture of a species whose aesthetic had evolved around precision rather than robustness. Her eyes were large, deep indigo, carrying the visual acuity that Selvari perceptual systems provided and that she deployed professionally as the primary tool of her observational methodology. Her hair was silver, the natural coloring that Selvari genetics produced, and that she maintained at a length that was practical for shipboard life, without being so short that it interfered with the cultural conventions of her species, which associated hair length with scholarly dedication through a connection that was traditional rather than logical, and that she maintained through the specific kind of compliance that people maintained with traditions they found arbitrary but harmless. She was reviewing her report. The report was comprehensive. 12 months of field research, condensed into the analytical framework that the Galactic Council's Security Directorate required for species threat assessments. A framework that evaluated military capability, strategic psychology, historical patterns, and expansion trajectory to produce a classification that would determine the Council's policy posture toward the assessed species for the next century. The classification her data supported was threat level 7. The scale went to 10. 7 was the threshold at which the Council's protocols transitioned from diplomatic management to active containment. The level at which a species was assessed as possessing both the capability and the psychological predisposition for actions that threatened galactic stability, and at which the Council's response shifted from engagement to restriction. The data supporting the classification was arranged on her display in the organized, section-by-section structure that her methodology required. She reviewed it with the professional attention that 12 months of accumulation warranted, and the personal weight that 12 months of immersion in humanity's behavioral record produced. Section 1. Military History. Earth's recorded history contained approximately 15,000 documented armed conflicts across 5,000 years of recorded civilization. The frequency was unmatched by any known species. The Caliphi, the next most conflict-prone civilization in the Council's records, had documented approximately 3,000 conflicts across a comparable period. The Moltari, classified as a warrior species, had documented approximately 4,000. Humanity's 15,000 was not an outlier. It was a different category of data, a frequency so far beyond the established range that the analytical framework required recalibration to accommodate it. The conflict's characteristics were equally distinctive. Total warfare, the mobilization of entire civilizations for the purpose of conducting war at the maximum scale available, appeared repeatedly in human history. The concept of total warfare did not exist in most species' military traditions, because most species' military traditions operated on the principle that warfare was conducted by designated military forces, while the civilian population continued normal function. Humanity's history included multiple instances of entire societies converting their economic, industrial, and social infrastructure to warfare production with a comprehensive commitment that her analytical framework classified as civilizational-scale predatory behavior. Section 2. Weapons Innovation. The subsection that produced the most consistent alarm responses in her Security Directorate reviewers. Humanity's approach to weapons development was characterized by two features that the threat assessment framework identified as high risk: adaptability and escalation. Adaptability, humans weaponized everything. Biological agents, chemical compounds, nuclear physics, kinetic energy, electromagnetic radiation, information systems, psychological manipulation, economic pressure, and combinations thereof that demonstrated a creative capacity for identifying destructive applications in any available resource that the analytical framework classified as extreme. Escalation. Each conflict in human history produced weapons of increased capability, the escalation proceeding with a momentum that appeared internally driven. Humans did not develop more powerful weapons in response to external threat, but in response to their own previous weapons. A recursive escalation cycle that had, in the span of 5,000 years, progressed from sharpened stones to weapons capable of sterilizing planetary surfaces. Section 3. Psychological Profile. The section that Lurie had spent the most time on and that produced the classification's most concerning element. Humans possessed predator psychology. The assertion was not metaphorical. Their evolutionary heritage included apex predation. Their neurological architecture carried the signatures of predator cognition, and their behavioral patterns expressed the characteristics that predator psychology produced. Threat assessment as default perceptual mode, territorial behavior, dominance hierarchy formation, pack coordination, and the specific psychological feature that the threat assessment framework identified as the highest risk element of predator species: the refusal to accept unfavorable outcomes. Most species psychology included acceptance mechanisms, cognitive architectures that processed unfavorable outcomes as data, recalibrated expectations, and adjusted behavior to accommodate the new reality. Human psychology included these mechanisms, but subordinated them to a competing drive: the imperative to change unfavorable outcomes rather than accept them. The drive was persistent, intense, and operated at levels ranging from individual problem-solving to civilizational mobilization. When humans encountered a situation they classified as unacceptable, their psychological response was not acceptance and adaptation, but resistance and action. The application of force, effort, and resources to the task of making the unacceptable acceptable, with a commitment that scaled to the magnitude of the unacceptability, and that the analytical framework could only describe as disproportionate. The combination, predator psychology, weapons innovation, total warfare tradition, and the disproportionate response to unacceptable outcomes, produced the threat profile that her report documented and that her classification reflected. Threat Level 7, active containment recommended, expansion restriction advised, preemptive measures considered appropriate if diplomatic containment proved insufficient. Lurie reviewed the report. The report was accurate. The data was comprehensive. The conclusion was supported. The categorical index's primary drive system failed at 1347 hours. The failure announced itself through the ship's emergency systems. Alarms that activated in the cascading sequence that indicated not a single system failure but a chain reaction, each alarm triggering the next as the cascade propagated through the drive's interdependent subsystems faster than the ship's automated safeguards could contain the spread. The primary containment field collapsed first, the magnetic architecture that confined the drive's energetic output losing coherence as the power distribution that maintained it was disrupted by the cascade. The propulsion system failed second, the drive's thrust generation ceasing as the containment failure robbed it of the focused energy output that propulsion required. Navigation failed third, the systems that calculated course and maintained trajectory losing their data inputs as the sensor arrays that fed them went dark. Environmental systems degraded fourth. The atmospheric processors, the thermal regulation, the life support architecture that maintained the conditions the Selvari crew required for survival. All of these drew power from the same distribution network that the drive failure was cascading through, and all of them began the progressive loss of function that power reduction produced. Atmospheric processing slowing, thermal regulation fluctuating, the ship's internal environment beginning the transition from habitable to marginal that would, if the degradation continued, eventually reach uninhabitable. Lurie experienced the failure from her analysis station, where the transition from scholarly review to emergency was marked by the specific sensory shift that catastrophic system failure produced, the change in the ship's ambient hum as the drive went silent, the fluctuation in lighting as the power distribution destabilized, the alarm sequence that her emergency training recognized, and that her body responded to with the physiological urgency that the alarms were designed to produce. The crew, 12 Selvari researchers and 4 Selvari operations staff, responded with the training that the academic consortium provided for shipboard emergencies. Systematic, organized, oriented toward damage assessment and system preservation, rather than the combat emergency responses that military vessels trained for. The damage assessment was conducted within minutes. The conclusion was not encouraging. The drive failure was total. Repair required components that the ship did not carry and expertise that the crew did not possess. The environmental system degradation was progressive. Current power reserves would maintain habitable conditions for approximately 18 hours before atmospheric processing fell below the threshold required for Selvari respiration. The ship's position, in the transit corridor between the Meridian and Verath human colonial systems, placed them in human-controlled space, distant from Selvari infrastructure, and dependent on whatever response the corridor's traffic could provide. The distress signal activated automatically. Universal emergency frequency. The signal broadcast the ship's identity, position, crew complement, species, and the nature of the emergency with the standardized format that every spacefaring civilization's emergency systems used and that every spacefaring civilization's vessels monitored. Lurie stood in the categorical index's operations center and processed the situation with the analytical discipline that her training provided. They were in distress, in human space, dependent on human response, and her 12-month threat assessment of the species they were dependent on had concluded, with comprehensive evidentiary support, that the species in question was one of the most dangerous civilizations the galaxy had ever produced. The irony was not lost on her. The irony was, in fact, so precisely calibrated that it felt less like coincidence and more like the universe's commentary on the limitations of threat assessments that evaluated civilizations from a distance. The first response arrived 11 minutes after the distress signal's activation. 11 minutes. Lurie noted the time because the time was data, and data was how she processed experience. 11 minutes for a response to a distress signal from an alien vessel in a human transit corridor. The Selvari Emergency Response Protocol for distress signals from non-Selvari vessels in Selvari-controlled space specified a response window of 4 to 6 hours, the window reflecting the time required for the nearest emergency-designated vessel to receive the signal, assess its validity, calculate an intercept course, and commit resources to the response. 11 minutes was not a response window. 11 minutes was a reflex. The responding vessel was the Bountiful Meridian, a human commercial freighter hauling industrial components on a standard colonial supply run. The ship's captain, a woman named Yara Akanjo, whose voice arrived on the Categorical Index's communication system with the specific quality of someone who was already changing course, while transmitting, provided information with the compressed efficiency of a person who was simultaneously managing a navigation adjustment and a communication, and whose multitasking was not effort but default. Research Vessel Categorical Index. This is the Bountiful Meridian. We have your distress signal. We are adjusting course for intercept. ETA 37 minutes. What is your crew complement and what is your atmospheric timeline? 16 Crew, Selvari. Atmospheric processing is degrading. Estimated 18 hours before conditions become critical. Copy 16 Selvari, 18 hours atmosphere. I'm broadcasting a relay of your distress on the corridor commercial frequency. We'll have additional responders. Additional responders. The phrase registered in Lurie's analytical framework as significant. The Bountiful Meridian was a commercial freighter. It was not an emergency response vessel. Its commitment to the rescue was voluntary, a commercial operator choosing to interrupt a revenue-generating freight run to assist an alien ship in distress. The choice was already notable. The additional responders suggested that the choice was not anomalous but expected, that the commercial frequency relay would produce, in the freight captain's assessment, other vessels making the same choice. Over the next 40 minutes, 16 additional vessels altered course for the Categorical Index's position. 16. Lurie documented each one as it appeared on the Operations Center's tracking display, the ship identifications, the vessel types, the course adjustments that each one was making to reach the distress signal's origin. Commercial freighters 3, passenger transports 2, independent cargo operators 6, a colonial survey vessel, a mining company shuttle, a family-operated trading ship, 2 private vessels whose registrations identified them as personal craft, individuals, not organizations, changing their plans and redirecting their ships for an alien vessel in distress. 17 ships total. For one vessel, the resource commitment was, by any rational analysis, disproportionate. The Categorical Index's crew of 16 did not require 17 rescue vessels. The emergency, while serious, was not of the magnitude that warranted a corridor-wide mobilization. The rational response, the response that Selvari emergency protocols would have produced, was a single designated rescue vessel, dispatched through proper channels, arriving within the response window that the protocols specified. The human response was not rational. The human response was the response of a species that had classified ship in distress as a problem, and that was applying its characteristic approach to problems. Overwhelming force, total commitment. The the disproportionate response that her threat assessment had identified as humanity's most dangerous behavioral trait, and that was currently expressing itself not as violence but as rescue. The recognition produced a cognitive dissonance that her analytical framework had not been designed to process. The behavioral pattern was identical. The application was opposite. The bountiful Meridian arrived first. Captain Akanjo, a woman in her 40s whose face carried the confident, practical expression of someone whose professional life involved solving problems in real time, and who was currently adding alien rescue to her problem-solving portfolio, with the adaptive efficiency that the expression communicated docked with the categorical index, using a procedure that Lurie's operations staff later described as technically irregular and practically perfect. The bountiful Meridian's docking system, connecting to the research vessel's maintenance port through a compatibility adaptation that should have required 30 minutes of calibration, and that Akanjo completed in 7, through a method that involved manual override of 3 safety protocols and a creative interpretation of docking geometry that the Selvari operations officer classified as impossible, then executed. The rescue operation that followed was the experience that restructured Lurie's understanding. She watched. She was an anthropologist. Watching was her professional function. And what she watched, over the 6 hours that the rescue operation required, was a case study in the behavioral architecture that her threat assessment had documented, the same architecture, applied to a purpose that the threat assessment had not considered. The bountiful Meridian's crew, 7 humans, a commercial freighter's standard complement, entered the categorical index with the organized urgency of people who had assessed a problem and were implementing a solution. The solution was not measured. The solution was not proportional. The solution was the same maximal, total commitment that her threat assessment had described in the context of human combat operations, applied to the task of keeping 16 Selvari researchers alive. They brought medical supplies, not the minimal emergency kit that a commercial freighter was required to carry. The expanded kit that someone aboard the bountiful Meridian had assembled specifically for this rescue, supplemented with Selvari-compatible medications that Akanjo had requested from another responding vessel's medical stores during the approach. The medical preparation demonstrated the same adaptive resource acquisition that Lurie's report had documented in human military logistics. The identification of a need, the rapid sourcing of the resource to meet the need, the creative combination of available materials to produce capability that the individual materials did not provide. They brought engineering capability. 2 of the bountiful Meridian's crew were technicians whose commercial experience included the specific systems that the categorical index's drive architecture was based on, not because human commercial technicians were trained in Selvari engineering, but because the underlying principles were similar enough that competence in one transferred to competence in the other. And the transfer was accomplished with the same adaptive, improvised capability that Lurie's report had documented in human weapons innovation. They could not repair the drive. They could stabilize the environmental systems, slowing the atmospheric degradation by rerouting power from non-essential systems to life support through a configuration that the ship's design had not intended, and that the technicians implemented by working from first principles rather than manuals. The first principles approach was what struck Lurie most profoundly. The humans did not have the specific knowledge that the categorical index's systems required. They had general knowledge, the understanding of how systems worked at the level of physics rather than the level of specific engineering. And they applied the general knowledge to the specific problem with the creative, adaptive, problem-solving intensity that her report had documented in the context of weapons development and military innovation. The same cognitive architecture, the same approach, the same refusal to accept the unfavorable outcome of "we don't know this system," and the same drive to change the unfavorable outcome through effort and adaptation. By the second hour, 2 additional vessels had docked: a passenger transport whose medical officer, a human woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, boarded the categorical index with a medical kit specifically configured for Selvari physiology that she had assembled during approach using pharmaceutical databases and cross-species medical protocols. She treated the categorical index's crew members who had suffered injuries during the drive failure's initial cascade: a concussion, 2 cases of atmospheric exposure, a fracture from an impact during the hull's structural shifting. With the focused, thorough intensity that Lurie observed with the specific attention of an anthropologist documenting a behavioral pattern that defied her existing framework, Dr. Chen exhausted her Selvari-compatible medical supplies. She then began adapting human medical supplies for Selvari application, calculating dosage conversions, identifying pharmaceutical compounds. "Then we'll handle it when it happens," Dr. Chen said, without looking up from the treatment she was administering. "Right now, the medical situation is here." The statement was delivered with the casual, absolute certainty that Lurie's report had classified as one of humanity's most dangerous psychological characteristics. The refusal to accept unfavorable outcomes combined with the complete commitment to the current problem, at the expense of future contingency. The characteristic was, in the threat assessment's military analysis, what made humans capable of suicidal determination in combat: the willingness to expend current resources against the current threat without reserving for future threats. The all-in commitment that made human military forces terrifying, because they did not operate with the proportional, conserved resource management that most species' military doctrine prescribed. The same characteristic, expressed in a medical context, produced a doctor who was emptying her ship's medicine cabinet for alien strangers, because the alien strangers were the current problem, and the current problem received everything. The station that received the categorical index's crew was Meridian Hub, a colonial installation serving the Meridian system's human settlements, a functional facility whose operational mandate was commercial support and colonial administration, and whose operational mandate had been temporarily supplemented by the addition of accommodate 16 Selvari refugees, whose research vessel suffered catastrophic drive failure. The accommodation was not grudging. The accommodation was the same overwhelming, disproportionate response that the rescue had been, scaled from ships to a station. Lurie documented everything. The documentation was compulsive, her anthropological training converting the experience into data, because the experience was exceeding her emotional processing capacity, and the data was the framework that held the excess. She documented the station's medical facility treating her crew with the same priority that it treated human patients, the triage protocols making no distinction between species, the medical staff adapting their procedures for Selvari physiology with the same aggressive improvisation that Dr. Chen had demonstrated, the facility's resources deployed for alien patients with no visible calculation of whether the deployment was diplomatically required or institutionally mandated. It was not required. It was not mandated. It was done because the patients were in the facility, and the facility treated patients. She documented the civilian response. The station's residential population, families, workers, administrators, the civilian infrastructure that colonial installations maintained, responded to the presence of Selvari refugees with a generosity that her analytical framework had no classification for. Food, clothing, offers of housing space. The donations arrived not through institutional channels but through individual initiative, people hearing that alien strangers were on their station and responding by bringing what they had. A family brought meals prepared with Selvari nutritional requirements researched from publicly available databases. An engineer volunteered to assist with the categorical index's drive assessment. A teacher brought educational materials for the children of the crew members who had children, materials translated into Selvari through an automated system whose translation quality was imperfect, but whose imperfection communicated more than perfection would have. The effort was genuine, made by someone who cared enough to try and whose trying was the point. She documented the children, a group of human children on the station, ages ranging from approximately 6 to 12, approached the Selvari crew members with the specific, uninhibited curiosity that human children displayed when encountering something new. The children asked questions. The questions were not filtered through diplomatic awareness or political calculation. They were the raw, honest inquiries of young minds encountering alien biology for the first time. Why is your skin that color? Can you see in the dark? Do you eat the same food as us? The questions were accompanied by offerings, small gifts that the children had selected from their own possessions, presented with the specific, universal gesture of children giving things to people they wanted to befriend. A drawing, a small toy, a piece of candy whose Selvari compatibility was uncertain but whose offering was sincere. The children's behavior was the data point that broke Lurie's analytical framework. Not because the behavior was surprising. Children's behavior was often the purest expression of a species' baseline social programming, unfiltered by the cultural conditioning that adult behavior accumulated. But because the children's behavior expressed the same pattern that every other human behavior she had observed during the rescue expressed, and the pattern was the pattern that her threat assessment had identified as humanity's most dangerous trait, and the children were expressing it by giving candy to aliens. The pattern, the refusal to accept unfavorable outcomes. In this case, the unfavorable outcome of these people are strangers, and therefore not our responsibility, combined with the disproportionate commitment to changing the unfavorable outcome through action. The children's action was small. The pattern driving the action was the same pattern that drove the 17-ship rescue response, the medical supply exhaustion, the station-wide mobilization. The same pattern that drove the total warfare, the weapons innovation, the civilizational-scale violence that her report documented. The same pattern, the same pattern. She sat in the station's guest quarters, provided by the station's administration without request, without negotiation, without the institutional processing that Selvari administrative systems would have required before allocating resources to non-citizen refugees. And she looked at the data she had collected across 12 months of research, and the data she had collected across 3 days of experience. And the two datasets occupied the same analytical space, and the space was too small for both, and one of them was going to have to reshape to accommodate the other. The 12 months of research said, humanity is one of the most dangerous civilizations the galaxy has produced. The capacity for violence is extreme. The psychological architecture supports the application of overwhelming force to problems classified as unacceptable. The recommendation is containment. The 3 days of experience said, the same architecture that produces the violence produces the rescue. The same psychology that refuses to accept loss in combat refuses to accept loss in crisis. The same disproportionate response that makes humans terrifying in war makes them the most effective emergency responders she has ever observed. The same species that can mobilize for extinction-level violence can mobilize with identical intensity for the preservation of strangers. The data sets were not in conflict. They were the same data, observed from different positions. The behavioral architecture was constant. The variable was context. The context determined whether the architecture expressed as destruction or preservation, as violence or compassion, as the most dangerous thing in the galaxy or the most reliable. The variable was not internal to humanity. The variable was external, the classification that the architecture received, enemy or person in need, threat or distress signal. The classification determined the output. The architecture provided the force, and the force was, in either application, total. She rewrote the report. The rewriting took 4 days in the guest quarters that the station had provided, working on the data terminal that the station's administration had arranged for her use when they learned she had work to complete. The arrangement made without her requesting it, because the station's response to learning that a guest had a need was to meet the need, and the meeting was performed with the same casual, automatic generosity that had characterized every interaction the station's population had had with the Selvari refugees. The rewriting was not a reversal. The data supporting the original threat assessment remained valid: humanity's military capability, its psychological architecture, its capacity for violence were accurately documented and correctly classified. The rewriting was an expansion. The original report described one expression of the behavioral architecture. The revised report described two. The revised report's classification was not threat level 7. The revised report's classification was a new category, one that the Security Directorate's framework did not contain, because the framework had not been designed to accommodate a species whose threat potential and protective potential were expressions of the same underlying characteristic, and whose classification therefore required a framework that could hold both assessments simultaneously without reducing either one. She drafted the conclusion in the guest quarters, on the data terminal, while the station continued its daily operations around her: the commercial traffic, the colonial administration, the civilian life that proceeded with the unremarkable normalcy of a community that had absorbed 16 alien refugees into its function, without disruption, because absorbing people in need was, for this community, not a disruption but a function. The conclusion read: humanity's behavioral architecture is characterized by a single dominant trait expressed across all contexts: the refusal to accept unfavorable outcomes combined with the disproportionate application of force to change those outcomes. This trait, which the original assessment correctly identified as the foundation of humanity's extreme military capability, is not limited to military expression. The trait is contextual. Its expression is determined by the classification that the architecture receives. When the unfavorable outcome is an enemy's existence, the expression is violence of the magnitude and determination that this assessment has documented. When the unfavorable outcome is a person's suffering, the expression is compassion of identical magnitude and determination. The galactic community's assessment of humanity as an existential threat is based on accurate data regarding one expression of this architecture. The assessment is incomplete. The complete assessment must account for the architecture's dual expression and must recognize that the variable determining which expression manifests is not internal to humanity, but external, determined by the relationship between humanity and the entity it is responding to. The practical implications are significant. Humanity classified as enemy will face the full force of the behavioral architecture in its destructive expression. The total warfare, the weapons innovation, the civilizational mobilization that this report documents. Humanity classified as ally, or simply as someone who needs help, will experience the same force in its preservative expression. The disproportionate rescue response, the resource commitment, the refusal to accept loss that makes them, in crisis, the most reliable responders any species has encountered. The recommendation of this report is not containment. The recommendation is engagement, the deliberate, strategic cultivation of a relationship in which humanity's classification of the galactic community is people who need help, rather than enemy. The difference between these classifications is the difference between experiencing humanity's most dangerous trait and benefiting from it. And the cultivation of the correct classification is, in this analyst's assessment, the most important diplomatic objective the Galactic Council has ever undertaken. The galaxy dreads humanity for their capacity for brutality. I have come to believe in them for their capacity for compassion. Both assessments are correct. Both describe the same species, the same psychology, the same behavioral architecture. The difference is context. The context is ours to determine. She submitted the report. The submission was accompanied by a personal annotation, an addendum that the Security Directorate's formal framework did not require, but that her professional integrity demanded. The data in this report was compiled through 12 months of archival research and 3 days of direct experience. The archival research produced the threat assessment. The direct experience produced the revised conclusion. I note for the record that the 3 days of direct experience provided more accurate understanding of humanity's behavioral architecture than the 12 months of archival research. And I recommend that future assessments of any species include direct experiential observation as a mandatory methodological component, because a species cannot be understood from its records alone. Records document what a species has done. Experience reveals what a species is, and what humanity is, in the experience of a Selvari researcher whose ship broke in their space and whose crew they saved at their own expense. What humanity is complicated and dangerous, and exactly what the galaxy needs if the galaxy is wise enough to ask for help instead of declaring war. She closed the data terminal. Outside the guest quarters, the station continued. Humans moved through their daily routines, working, living, managing the ordinary business of a colonial installation that had done an extraordinary thing, and that did not consider the thing extraordinary because helping was what they did, and the helping was not exceptional but baseline. The default response of a species whose psychology refused to accept the unfavorable outcome of someone needed help, and we did nothing, with the same absolute, total, disproportionate commitment that it refused to accept any other unfavorable outcome. Lurie watched them. She watched with the anthropologist's eye that had documented their violence and their compassion, and that now held both in the same analytical space, not reconciled, because reconciliation implied they had been in conflict, and they had not been in conflict. They had been the same thing seen from different angles. The angle had changed. The thing had not. The galaxy dreaded humanity for their brutality. She believed in them for their compassion. And both assessments were true, simultaneously, permanently, inseparably. The same species, the same architecture, the same overwhelming force, applied with equal totality to the tasks of destruction and preservation. And the difference between the two was not in them but in the world they faced, and the world they faced could choose which expression it received. The choice, she thought, watching humans carry food to alien strangers on a station that had no obligation to feed them, should be obvious.